Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining. My paper is about Kondylis's dialogue with sociology, and I aim to tackle Weberian, Neo-Kantian, and Kulturkritik patterns in his thought. So you will pardon me that it's going to be a dry presentation because I'm going to read what I've written. So this paper suggests that an appraisal of Kondylis's dialogue with sociology is long overdue. While Kondylis's work is well known and acclaimed in Germany and enjoys a wide readership in Greece, the position of sociology in his writings deserves closer scrutiny. Recently, Kondylis's contributions to Greek sociology have been briefly appraised. This I did with a colleague of mine when we wrote a book about sociology in Greece, its history and development, with Palgrave Springer, and we have several pages on Kondylis, who is not a sociologist, but we intimate that he has contributed a lot to the formation of the discipline in Greece. So this tilt of focus, in other words, to look at Kondylis's sociological aspects, is further necessitated by what appears to be both a substantive and tactical recourse to sociology on Kondylis's part. Beyond arguments that place his system into a variant of decisionism, the merit and validity of Kondylis's sociological excursions must be seen as integral components of his critique of normativity across philosophy, sociology, and ethics. I shall argue, therefore, that Kondylis's substantive partnership with sociology is laid systematically in his incomplete The Political and Man. The case for a social ontology aims at rectifying what for Kondylis is a moribund and sterile sociologism. Beyond his search for a socio-ontological spectrum that is even more foundational than sociology's conception of the social, Kondylis assigns to Max Weber a privileged explanatory position as opposed to other founders of sociology, both classical and contemporary. Moreover, he draws on sociological paradigms that call for scrutiny as to Kondylis's tactical mode of reading major sociologists. In addition, when Kondylis engages in cultural critique and diagnostics, he draws on other sociological patterns. Here, the argument around modernity as mass society goes into the heart of analogous sociological dissections of contemporary society's constitution, which for Kondylis has morphed into a largely amorphous mass democracy. In Greek scholarship, for example, it is Yorgos Faraklas in 2013, in what is a lengthy and laborious critical engagement with Kondylis's system, which makes the case for Kondylis's thought being rooted in Daniel Bell's sociology, because beyond what he also discerns as a convergence with Weberian motifs. Yet for all of Kondylis's assurances to the contrary, namely that his case for social ontology has no normative presuppositions, his insistence on the equidistant poles of the socio-ontological spectrum, friend, enemy, order, disorder, accommodates unwittingly, but no less unproblematically for his architectonic, latent normative concepts as well as metaphysical assumptions. So, for example, his reference to historical equibalence. These, I shall argue, emanate from a resurgence of the Neo-Kantian and neo-Platonist controversy over values, core elements of which suffuse sociology to this day. So why then a sociological refocus on Kondylis? In our book, Georgia Lagoumitzi and I discerned a deficit among sociologists with regards to a systematic engagement with Kondylis as a formidable partner of sociological reason who enters sociology through philosophy. I shall leave aside Kondylis's systematic references to sociology in nearly all of his works, as well as his significant contributions to shaping the sociological landscape in Greece, translating and editing seminal sociological theory books. I will only focus on the substantive sociological relevancies and merits, as well as on limitations in the sociological permutations that buttress his philosophical edifice of decisionism and nihilism. Although nihilism has been the focus of Greek Kondylis scholars like Raymond Petridis, the sociological adjuncts that enable Kondylis to embark on what is essentially a sociological theory magnum opus, The Political and Man, remain an uncharted territory for Greek sociologists. In broad strokes, I argue, therefore, that a sociological refocus on Kondylis' dialogue with sociology is pressing, aiming to untangle the following threads. First, the emergence of sociological reason within Kondylis' philosophical corpus, based on the axis of a descriptive theory of decision, henceforth descriptive decisionism. Second, the descriptive cultural criticism through the lens of the planetary shape of mass democracy. Thirdly, and principally, I discuss the pivotal role of sociology as the bridge between descriptive decisionism and mass democracy through the mediating and irreducible for Kondylis layer of social ontology. As a result, and this is the fourth thread, the rehabilitation of Kondylis' move to embed sociology into his philosophical architectonic is posited for me primarily as an issue of restoring scholarly justice within the community of sociologists in Greece. Secondarily, but no less significantly, to posit a major challenge to Greek sociologists, summoning them, as it were, to assume a standpoint and to positioning sociology in relation to the lens of Kondylis' epistemology and social diagnostics. How, in other words, Kondylis appraises sociology, implements it, and ultimately divests it from its very kernel, the social. So Kondylis introduces the necessity of clarifying the layer of social ontology in early 20th century philosophy, which was under the influence of sociology. As a result, sociology and social ontology became closely entangled, virtually indistinguishable at points, crystallizing in a hybridization that proved for Kondylis to be detrimental to both sociology and social ontology. Kondylis' quest for a socio-ontological realm from which historical configurations are formed and sociological categories crystallize through various shapes. So, for example, the book addresses positivism, ideal typical methodology, Verstehen hermeneutics, functionalism, conflict theory, formal sociology, symbolic interactionism, rational choice theory, systems theory, communicative action, among many other sociological paradigms. This enables him to proceed with a very systematic, albeit selective interpretation of key sociological texts. Central to Kondylis' reconstruction of sociological theory is his repulsion of rationalist and normative accounts of the social, representatives of which are Durkheim, Parsons, and Habermas. For him, these paradigms elevate the communicative rationality of the agent or a normatively anchored interaction, such as the case of George Herbert Mead, to criteria of the series of causally discernible phenomena in social reality, and to subject the latter to deontological judgments. So in other words, Kondylis' motif that ultimately what lies in the realm of the ontological is processed normatively, which is what he considers to be the foul play in sociology. The is-ought tension for Kondylis between facts and values is irreconcilable, and normative paradigms that claim otherwise end up as an index of the impasses of sociological enlightenment and its culmination in an ethical nihilism. So, for example, when Kondylis, in his book on enlightenment, chides Habermas, because Habermas cites Kondylis, and he says that Habermas has actually misunderstood him, it's interesting that he talks about nihilism in this sense. He understands nihilism as a psychological and sociological genealogy of ethics, describing how, in the context of social life, self-love through institutions is transformed into ethics. So how, in other words, claims to power are transformed through institutional processes into ethical imperatives. The questions that lead to a reconstruction of sociology through the lens of a now crystallized socio-ontological level pertain to the constitution of the social in such a way that any causal hierarchies and law-like regularities prove to be inherently unstable. This is because they're vulnerable to the fluid boundaries among sociology specialisms or to the multitude of factors and forces that stem from the socio-ontological realm. Their indeterminate crisscrossing renders open and malleable the social's own becoming. According to the socio-ontological standpoint, the social being is beyond consolidation in some historical or institutional teleology, and is also resistant to hierarchical ordering in terms, say, of functions or degrees of normative fulfillment. Arguing against sociological hypostazations or dehistoricizations, Kondylis mobilizes social ontology on the side of historicism as opposed to what he calls a superficial sociologism. This superficial sociologism occludes this indeterminate and fundamental realm of social ontology. Such socio-ontologically grounded historicism holds normatively configured sociological concepts and reveals their inadequacy when the latter claim transhistorical or universal validity. Symmetrically, as it were, Kondylis rebuts what he calls, I quote, relativist vulgar sociology, and treats categories as mere projections on the part of the social scientist. Rather, it is the socio-ontological bedrock that is the condition for understanding diverse life worlds. Drawing on Max Weber's perspectivism, a likely source of which, as I will propose in this paper, is Emil Lask, Kondylis holds that any, and I quote, substantial axiological relativism on the part of the researcher accommodates not only the historical method, but also the historical equivalence, unquote. Such relativism is precisely the vehicle for the understanding that is grounded in social ontology. Now, part of Kondylis' strategy is to retain the primordial realm outside any mediations by history and by society's institutional constitution, and to assure that all historically specific in terms of genesis, institutional crystallizations that claim suprahistorical adequacy turn out to be no more than ideological compressions of social ontology. These are somehow renewed by this primordial realm, the vitality of which, for Kondylis, is even called archaic. Now, the special sociological relevance of Kondylis' project is reflected in the following claim. Quote, social ontology is the ontology of the social. The social is what specifically characterizes the being of society. In other words, society as a special socio-ontological concept and the social coincide. The being of society as a primordial fact consists as such the natural beginning of social ontology, exactly as the being of the world generally, a primordial fact too, was the intellectual conditio sine qua non of philosophical ontology, unquote. Working with limiting concepts such as order and disorder at the extremes of the socio-ontological spectrum, Kondylis urges the historian and the sociologist to examine specific historical and sociologically valid shapes of order and disorder, and to focus on the specific causes and reasons that shift the socio-historical pendulum in this or that direction within the spectrum. Now, as a very brief reminder of Kondylis' conceptual arsenal, the constitutive socio-ontological moments are the following: the social relation, the political, and man. Like the social relation spectrum with its friend-enemy extremes, or even the movement between a convergence and a containment of deviating actors, so for Kondylis, at this ontological layer, the political is called the interaction of all interactions and accounts for the order and integration of the social as opposed to a disorderly possibility. As for the anthropological dimension of the social ontology, man, this oscillates between an integrally induced sociality and an integrally induced human finitude. Such is the being of society that justifies the perspective and subject matter of social ontology. Drawing essentially on philosophical anthropology, Kondylis accepts that there are certain qualities and capabilities specific to the human species. He also adds the tendencies that lead humans to enter the political constellation. He aligns social ontology with a socio-ontologically oriented anthropology to configure a notion of man on the axis of an exclusively human formation of culture. He also seems here to violate his own desideratum for equal value among the three socio-ontological components, when it is plain to see that without the anthropological factor, a necessary condition, the socio-ontological collapses even as an idea, as it would be divested of a standpoint of relevance. Unless, of course, Kondylis implies that the social ontological is valid even if not related at all to human value spheres, which in this case, this consequence secretes into Kondylis' architectonic of social ontology a Neo-Kantian Platonism about the objective validity of values, like the one, for example, which Heinrich Rickert advocated. In fact, the decisionist spectrum of the friend-enemy distinction extends even to values. And this resembles Cornelius Castoriadis's ontology of the imaginary. Now, Castoriadis writes, quote, "Total order and total disorder are not the components of the real, but limiting concepts which we abstract from, pure constructions which taken in absolute terms, become illegitimate and incoherent," unquote. Now, if Kondylis had contained his quest for the socio-ontological in the heuristic value of concept formation, which Kondylis explicitly denies, he would have escaped Castoriadis' objections to such limiting concepts. Because, however, Kondylis posits, and I quote, that the socio-ontological level is deeper than the ethical, unquote, and that it includes ethical as well as non-ethical standpoints, as the real end of the broadest possible spectrum, he can be seen to regress to a decisionist foundationalism. It is on these grounds that Kondylis admits that Weber came closest to socio-ontology when he conceived the multitude of combinations between value rational and instrumental rational action, but he claims, Kondylis, that Weber erred as a sociologist on how, I quote, he extended ideal typical in their elaboration historical sociological contents to the area of social ontology, unquote. So he accuses Weber of illegitimately mistaking ideal types for the socio-ontological. So the critique on Weber here is that he illegitimately uses the juxtaposition between value rational and instrumental rational action as a criterion for understanding socio-ontological situations. Now, it is to Kondylis' credit that he sets criteria of self-reference and self-refutation for his theory. And incidentally, for him, theories are manifestations of the will to power. But the criterion to which he seeks the role of tribunal cannot be for him another contesting theory, but rather, as he says, empirical research that interestingly supersedes the conceptual spectrum of Kondylis' proposed theory. Now, why such empirically adduced falsification cannot stem from a rival theory, for example, a theory that would deny the fact-value dichotomy, remains unaccounted for. Regarding social ontology, therefore, I argue that Kondylis is working within a Weberian and Neo-Kantian epistemology. Now, the links to Weber are considered by Kondylis himself on several occasions and need not be revisited in detail, although they are of cardinal significance for his sociological epistemology. However, the Neo-Kantian influence is one that, to my knowledge, has not been sufficiently addressed. I argue that the perspectivism that suffuses his descriptive decisionism is a variant that stems not only from Nietzsche and Weber, but it cuts across the Neo-Kantian hiatus irrationalis as articulated by Emil Lask, who, by the way, was praised by Max Weber in Weber's book on Roscher and Nies. It is Emil Lask who claims that, I quote, contingent, arbitrary, and atomized character of individual existence is responsible for a hiatus irrationalis between thought and reality. The hiatus emerges for Lask because reality cannot be derived from concepts. and it is irrational because reality can become rational only through concepts which abstract from it. Thus, the part, concepts, particularistically constructed from a specific perspective, is a condition for understanding the whole. The irreducible facticity of reality generates a gap between it and questions of law and normativity. Essentially, reality is anomic, or, to quote Max Weber, irrational. To ground the possibility of historical knowledge, and we add sociological, Lusk rejects the idea of that which is general, that merely emits its individual manifestations. In other words, he claims that if all concrete phenomena are mere instances of the general phenomenon, then they would be axiologically indifferent. The fact, though, that they're not, indicates that the hiatus works as a pivot for what is essential to socio-historical knowledge. And what is essential is value individuality. You will pardon my appalling German accent, but the term is Wertindividualität. If all concepts had value on the level of generality, they would be contained by the value that is attributed in the general concept, and therefore one would not need to look at their particular manifestations. This would be a standpoint of value universalism, Wertuniversalismus. Such a universal standpoint would neutralize historicity and the perspectivist locus of human interests that assign value to reality. Thus, far from being a deficit, the hiatus irrationalis is a condition for historical knowledge. Now, this digression on Emil Lusk is important, and it may tilt the epistemological parameters of Kondylis' theory of knowledge. Let us consider, for example, Kondylis' definition of decision from his Science, Power, and Decision. I quote, "Decision is therefore a partly conscious and a partly unconscious act or process of distinction through which a structured and hierarchical worldview emerges, which guarantees the necessary for survival capability of orientation and serves the acquisition of power, providing a stable identity," unquote. Or, in his Power and Decision, he conceives knowledge in terms of, first, the reduction of what is unfamiliar to what is familiar. This is the version, in other words, of the value individualism articulated by Lusk. The uncharted totality is perceived by a particular standpoint, and it is rendered familiar within the relevancies of that particular standpoint. Second, the entanglement of this reduction with an axiological judgment, namely that when we carve through a decision a piece from reality, we make an axiological judgment. So what is relevant from what is not relevant, according to the observer's perspective, this is a notion that, as was mentioned yesterday, is also very central to Niklas Luhmann's systems theory. A third consequence is that for Kondylis, the value judgment which establishes the prime distinction between the familiar and the unfamiliar is tantamount to a hermeneutic horizon. And fourth, what emerges from this arch distinction is perspectival, and thus it reflects only particular and contextual human interests, which are condensed to adaptive and goal attainment exigencies. One notes here that adaptation and power constitute two of the four functional imperatives in Talcott-Parsons' systems theory. Yet Kondylis relegates the other two imperatives, societal integration, which is tantamount to solidarity, and latent pattern maintenance, which is the equivalent of values, to either functional conditions or to ideological superimpositions on adaptation and power. Thus, for Kondylis, social ontology is theorized as this primordial realm from which social sciences slice a perspective often mistaking it for the socio-ontological realm as a totality. He writes, quote, "Carried away by the fact that the socio-ontological material is one and indivisible, social science tends to identify its thematic field with the socio-ontological area in its entirety, or to regard it as an objectively privileged core of its field," unquote. Sociology and social ontology cannot therefore coincide. If they did, the same types of social relations would be manifested across all societies. However, if social facts or social relations and their institutional crystallizations are mediated by the formless socio-ontological spectrum, however, this socio-ontological spectrum is not entirely formless because it has polar opposites which assume specific and historically shaped semantic load, then Kondylis does not uphold symmetry. This happens because for him, the social ontological is not mediated by historically processed and solidified social facts. Thus, social crystallizations of the socio-ontological do not impact the socio-ontological and they don't reflect back on the socio-ontological. Kondylis is actually proclaiming the socio-ontological to be an ancient idea which has been articulated vaguely or less vaguely across historical cultures. Now, of course, if such articulations, historical articulations, of the socio-ontological have equal degrees of adequacy remains unaccounted for. When in Power and Decision, Kondylis concedes that value-free knowledge is never generalizable, but is restricted in the margins, reserved only for those, and I quote, who are in a position to appreciate knowledge and observations that are practically redundant or even inhibitive, unquote. This is in the first pages of Power and Decision. He reveals a style of thought that for Karl Mannheim's sociology of knowledge would be tantamount to the free floating intellectual. We can say that this is a sort of Weberian Übermensch whose epistemic integrity inhibits him from tainting his scheme with installing to it those unavoidable for society's reproduction ideological fictions. But as a style of thought, Kondylis' retreatism masks behind his descriptive power an elitism that comes dangerously close to ressentiment criticism, as the elitist intellectual must resist his subsumption to a slave morality of ideological values that inflate particularistic perspective, masking their partial worldview as universalism. To this end, very early in that book, he feels obliged to remind readers that normative principles and values have not accomplished in history what they owe it towards the direction of a harmonious coexistence of human beings, unquote. I want to repeat that quote, please. He says, quote, normative principles and values have not accomplished in history what they owe it towards the direction of a harmonious coexistence of human beings, unquote. He also alerts them to how such lofty ideals have often served aggressive acts and mutual extinction. Of course, historical evidence in this direction can be gleaned from 20th century eruptions of evil amid Enlightenment, as argued by Adorno and Horkheimer in their 1944 Dialectic of Enlightenment. In fact, Kondylis adduces in an elitist jargon what he ascribes to be his own power. He talks, referring to his own theory, he refers to it as the perfect comeback, claiming that his epistemological coup de grace is validated by history. In other words, for Kondylis, the apostles of the greater disasters and sufferings caused to humanity were not relativists, skeptics, and nihilists, but self-righteous moralists. Of course, here Kondylis neglects Benito Mussolini's elevation of relativism to the cornerstone of fascism. In other words, for Mussolini, relativism is equivalent to fascism because it's a standpoint, like fascism, where no one is constrained by anything. And this was an essay that Mussolini wrote in 1921, Relativismo e Fascismo. Or Kondylis is silent about the fact that Marquis de Sade was a popular author among the Nazis, as Hannah Arendt suggests in The Origins of Totalitarianism. However, the flip side to that coin is quickly dismissed, yet it shows a recalcitrance that Kondylis safely ignores. Values and norms have accomplished remarkable degrees of convergence between warring parties, and the mutual broadening of ethical values and human rights, for all their vulnerability towards being confiscated in order to mask power aggrandizement. So that is undeniable, but this in itself doesn't invalidate the ethical validity of values, of universal values or the rights of man. This notion seems to expose Kondylis's rampant discrediting of normativity as a straw man. Not only that, conflating identity and power, Kondylis fails to differentiate between the struggle for survival in the identity of, say, an Indian multi-billionaire and a Dalit, without considering the gap in their power as something other than the perspectival slicing of reality. Both the millionaire and the Dalit, this is my own example, struggle for survival. Even if all social worldviews, as well as scientific paradigms, contain the polar opposite of the good and the noble in various shapes of the enemy, and here one can easily confirm Kondylis by recourse to anthropological work on purity and danger by Mary Douglas, or On the Left and the Right by Marcel Mauss, or even the qualifications that Kondylis introduced around the universal gift-giving practices that Moses, the gift, has outlined. The fact remains that such worldviews also entail the possibility of a transcendence of enmity. Applied to science, this is tantamount to transcending scientific controversies. On this, Kondylis is correct, if one factors the passion of the contesting parties. So, for example, Bruno Latour played this up in his Sociology of Science. But when conflicts are appeased, then anything that can be considered a menial deviance could potentially imply enmity. In other words, what I'm saying is that there is a risk in Kondylis to always, like Luhmann, when enmity takes very adversarial or even violent forms, and these forms are being curbed, but nonetheless, enmity is transfigured again into a milder form within the friend-enemy spectrum. What I'm actually saying here is that the conflation between enmity and different degrees of enmity has been held in check by sociology in 1895, when Durkheim, in the Rules of Sociological Method, like a true Kantian, argues that the elimination of all deviance, he actually uses the term crime, would reduce humans to automata and deprive them of their freedom, which of course here, their freedom includes the one to make primordial decisions. Given Kondylis' sympathies for Lamettrie's materialistic conception of man, one wonders if the specter that haunts Kondylis' continuous deferral and inflation of enmity as deviance does not deprive his notion of agency for what he mostly cherishes, the capacity to decide what aspect of reality can be selected, interpreted, infused with value, and function as an axis of meaning-conferring survival machines, whether these are individuals or groups. While Kondylis admits that the enemy's annihilation in actual reality must be eternally deferred to make sovereignty sustainable and legitimate, the annihilation, this is the term that he's using, on the level of worldviews must be thorough. Now, what seems to escape Kondylis is the growth of knowledge as a mutually forged learning process, which curbs animosities as the warring parties learn from each other and broaden their view comparatively and self-critically. Contrary to the frequently adduced prerequisite for a consistent value-free theory, abstinence from polemics is not really Kondylis's forte. Even in his programmatic book, Power and Decision, he is compelled to denigrate philosophical discourses which are held, I quote, in tawdry salons, universities, and philological cafes, unquote. Now, one can surmise that it is Habermas's structural transformation of the public sphere that is the target here, potentially the Greek intellectual community too, but strategically in Kondylis's semantics, it is interesting to note that the university, as a field of philosophical discourse, as a space, is not preceded by a pejorative epithet. Its denigration is implicit and tainted by its in-between placement along with the tawdry salons and cafes. Ultimately, the very promulgation of a value-free descriptive theory of decision is inconsistent as an utterance aiming at an audience. Kondylis concedes for himself some purely materialistic, in La Métrie sense, indulgences in providing and announcing such a theory. So he refers to his own motives for doing it as a writer's vanity or the pleasure of provocation. But one could add here a masked ressentiment criticism. Cornering the consistency of a value-free theory of decision to the realm of silence, Kondylis seeks to hit two birds with one stone, to be able to claim consistency, but also to victimize the value-free theory of decision as a potentially threatening for social cohesion approach to knowledge. But the logic of silence, if this is what the skeptic should do, is already refuted by Luhmann, because silence's advantage, in other words, not emitting signs that can be interpreted as imperatives and thus leading to commitment, is a disadvantage and a systemic weakness. Those addressees of silence can interpret the silent interlocutor in any way they wish. They can impute to silence anything from laziness, cowardice, sour grapes resentment, lack of resolve, and theoretical weakness. But also, equally debilitating for Kondylis is the alternative provided by the sociologist of science Stephen Shapin in his book A Social History of Truth. This suggests at one point a different reading of the Weberian decision in the shape of an ethic of responsibility. Shapin cites the philosopher Michael Polanyi, who opts for the scientist's scientific conscience, personal responsibility, something akin to Max Weber's ethics of responsibility. That is, the scientist's power of commitment with a universal intent. A decision to believe is not arbitrary and self-serving, as in Kondylis' theory, but for Polanyi, responsible. Consequently, truth is something that can be thought of only by believing it. The fiduciary component, the component of trust. Here, it's worth quoting Michael Polanyi. Quote, "We must now recognize belief once more as a source of all knowledge. Tacit assent and intellectual passions, the sharing of an idiom and of cultural heritage, affiliation to a like-minded community. Such are the impulses which shape our vision of the nature of things on which we rely for our mastery of things. No intelligence, however critical or original, can operate outside such a fiduciary framework," unquote. In this sense, the fiduciary substratum is a transcendental condition for knowledge claims, even an impulse for Polanyi. Such a fiduciary embeddedness of knowledge claims would, of course, include Kondylis' decisionism, at best as a skeptical experiment, at worst as a spectacular gesture of retreatism, for which, of course, one can search Robert Merton's patterns of deviant syndromes among the community of scientists to find an explanation. As a skeptic, therefore, Kondylis wants to be listened to. His books are masterfully constructed, yet sometimes with an inconsistency that is hard to understand, in contemptuously bypassing or in ardently following scholarly conventions, respectively defiant of notes and bibliography, or, like The Political and Man and the Book on Enlightenment, replete with them. The echo of Kondylis' theory, despite his radical skepticism, qua value-free decisionism, qua nihilism, calls for reception. Like every theory, it must enter the community's judgment and be assessed on its merits, the challenges it poses, and the opportunities it provides for extending the boundaries of epistemological assumptions in the natural and the social sciences. However, as shaping contents, the moral commitment in talking about the same reality we all inhabit is something that a radical skeptic like Kondylis cannot dismantle, since Kondylis himself objects to incivility. One can look at the intemperate exchange of opinions with Richardos Someritis over the prospect of war between Greece and Turkey that were published in the newspaper Tovima from 1997 to 1998, where Kondylis defends civility as a precondition for polemics. Yet Kondylis risks endorsing theoretical incivility as he denigrates all those fellow philosophers or social theories whose theory is not compatible with his. Kondylis' diminution of trust as a primordial component of social life cannot elide this normative substratum, holding trust, as he says, to be always a partial component. Rather, Kondylis transfers the horizon of a shared world to the socio-ontological realm, which for him is common in all life worlds. Notwithstanding Kondylis' erudition and impressive reconstruction of a rich pool of sociological theories, some problems that are both epistemological and substantive with regards to the mechanics of his architectonic surface. For example, Kondylis seems at points to indulge in eclecticism with regards to the textual support he can enunciate from the major sociologists whose thought he draws upon. Sometimes this happens in ways that cast doubt into Kondylis' own penchant for systematics. One such case is his reading of Talcott Parsons. Indicatively, in The Political and Man, he writes that Parsons was prevented from considering the extension of social action across the socio-ontological spectrum. This happens for Kondylis because Parsons shapes the social system along predetermined normative coordinates. So, for example, if colleagues are not familiar with Parsons, he devised this a priori system of functional prerequisites, which are both inductive and deductive, and are held to account for all societies: adaptation, goal attainment, integration, and latent pattern maintenance. Adaptation is largely connected to, say, but not exclusively, to the economy, goal attainment to polity, social integration to law and the civil society, whereas latent pattern maintenance refers to values, which in institutions like religion, family, can, in a sense, become diffuse in society. So Kondylis holds Parsons in check, but neglects Parsons's modalities, which are crucial in Parsons, of inflation and deflation, which are integral to each functional prerequisite's own spectrum. Inflation and deflation arrest, but now from within society, not outside society, the socio-ontological spectrum, not vice versa. So someone could argue that Parsons has developed an architectonic of understanding societies analytically, but also being able to provide a normative benchmark with regards to their evolution in terms of complexity and normative inclusion, that anticipates the socio-ontological spectrum, but from within society, not outside society. Because in Kondylis, it is the opposite. Society is held in check by the indeterminate totality of the socio-ontological spectrum. A further issue, therefore, with regards to the validity of social ontology is this. One hurdle stems from the fact that the being of society violates the logical requirement of a middle position. In other words, friendship and enmity are not equally primordial in terms of the logical constitution of the social. At this juncture, Kondylis risks being subject to Luhmann's criticism against Hegel, which was that, so Luhmann says that for Hegel, even the criminal who breaks the law acknowledges the law because the criminal is on the run. So that criticism could be hailed against Kondylis because he seems to argue that the asocial is part of the social. For Luhmann, this is normative grand theories as foul play. And while Kondylis, of course, rejects normativity as a foundational layer of the social, neutralizing the social in this way leaves him exposed to advancing a super-social constellation, social ontology, which includes as social even the very suspension of the social. The other line of criticism is that both anthropological evidence, which of course Kondylis collects judiciously, as well as contemporary evidence from world value surveys in sociology, show an intrinsic to the social primacy of friendship surplus. So this evidence casts doubt on Kondylis' assertion in The Political and Man that higher levels of differentiation in a society imply, I quote, a greater qualitative richness or a larger quantity of qualities. Here, the world value surveys by Inglehart point to a different direction in terms of larger amounts of post-materialist values. Indices of income inequality across the world's most affluent societies also show correlations between highly differentiated social systems and larger quantities of less inequality. So, for example, one can check the seminal work by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level, 2006. Less inequality and more well-being. What Kondylis, of course, is attacking here is the entire tradition from Hegel's Sittlichkeit to Durkheim's organic solidarity and Parsons's value-steered complex social systems like the United States, or we can say the Scandinavian societies in terms of their welfare metrics. Now, more complicated is the triptych social ontology, mass democracy, and the repulsion of normativity and binding values. The latter, as we've seen, are theorized as functionally expedient stabilizations within the socio-ontological spectrum. Now, given Kondylis' assurances towards a value-neutral and non-ideological sociological diagnostics, what he imputes to mass democracy is contrary to descriptive decisionism. So, for example, he laments, but now he sets normative criteria, that value pluralism under conditions of mass democracy degenerates in total anarchy. But the idea of decline is in itself problematic, as it smuggles through the back door a melancholy science standpoint, coupled at crucial points with an unwarranted by the standards of descriptive theory polemics. Indicative passages here include those that reflect the dissolution of the essence of the person into a matrix of points upon a line with no beginning and end. So the person is set up as a matrix of points as if standing on a line that has no beginning and no end. What is presented here as descriptive diagnosis is replete with the post-humanist jargon of the dissolution of the person. And I quote from the Mass Democracy book. Kondylis writes, "The internally dissolved person as a number of society comprises a weak, deprived of identity and anonymous point which is lost amid the monochrome and anonymous structures when the particular features of the person are condensed into mere points, unquote. Now, this representation of man under mass democracy is not too distant from the man without qualities or the qualities without man, as in Robert Musil's 1930 philosophical novel. More importantly, however, in terms of a sociological architectonic of modernity, Kondylis seems to underestimate those factors within the postmodern mass democratic constellation that converge within the social and make claims for an ecumenical globality which sublates elements of the synthetic harmonizing schema into what is prevailing for Kondylis, that is the analytical combinatory schema under mass democracy. Here, one also bumps on Kondylis's eclecticism and perspectivism. He sometimes seems to select only those clusters of concepts from the sociologists whose theories he considers that serve his ends. Therefore, not only did not Daniel Bell, resign in face of the motley of power relationships in the multitude of analytical combinations under conditions of post-industrial society. Instead, Bell sought to rekindle natural law normatively and think its harmonization with a scheme of rotating worldviews, all of which can be considered to be humanly enriching as part of a mutually forged learning process. Daniel Bell actually formulates this normative project as a utopia without illusions. The discarding of illusions places him on a similar plane to Kondylis. Yet for Bell, the notion of autonomous agency presupposes entitlements and rights, and in this sense he would depart from Kondylis, who rejects the fact-value dichotomy. Kondylis's perspectivism is sublated here as Bell advises us, and I quote from Bell, to rotate the pictures we see through cosmographies to see the entire gestalt. Now, if social ontology holds in check the normative fictions within mass democratic settings, along with the latter's relativistic consequence, then it is posited as a historically mediated theory. And moreover, it rejects the normative processing that a significant body of sociology upholds with regards to mass democracy. I will skip, because I see I only have like 6 minutes left, a page in how Kondylis uses the notion of ecumenism, which to me it seems to derive from Catholicism and particularly in philosophy and sociology from Max Scheler. And I want simply to
excuse me.
Sure.
You can keep going. We have a 30-minute extra, so you can read the page and keep going.
Great. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for clarifying this. So let me see where I stopped. So, in other words, Kondylis fails to account for a logic of social institutions that uphold norms within the mass democratic shape. Now, the same way, he rejects the subsumption of rationality to an ethical rationality. In reading Weber, he asserts the role of the value-neutral relativist scientist who accommodates the historical method and also some historical equibalence. Now, interestingly, the requirements for equality or equibalence are only formal and methodological because they are premised on the socio-ontological irrationality of life. On the other hand, Kondylis resorts to Catholic terminology when he adduces ecumenical rationality, but reserves it only for the pre-normative and pre-ethical realm. He thus confiscates an ethical notion and transfigures it to the ground of any possible ethics. In a Nietzschean fashion, he reserves what Weber called instrumental rationality, and he relegates a logic of combinations for the mass democratic mindset in what for him is, and I use his words, a low qualitative level. Kondylis considers the mass democratic global evolution as one that demands the sacrifice of other non-Western forms of collective life, yet the West's polyhedral, as he mentions it, ecumenism, and one here wonders, is this ecumenism only Western project, or can this ecumenism be seen in other civilizations and cultures as well, such as India, for instance? So, on the one hand, global evolutionism, prompted by the West, demands the collateral damage, as it were, of cultures which cannot adapt to modernization and so on. On the other hand, the ecumenism that is part of Western values seems to acknowledge the refractory richness of such diverse cultures. Now, typical for Kondylis' primacy of decision is his apostrophe, and I quote, that history cuts Gordian knots and does not untie them, unquote. Now, some other normative strains in Kondylis' version of social ontology are the following. There seems to be an empirical and inductive surplus of friendship, and this is an idea that comes from Durkheim, in the very constitution of the social. So Durkheim, for instance, talks about valeurs affectives, affective values, which enable atomized physical human beings to come together and form a social. So Durkheim, for instance, gives primacy into the very constitution of the social of affective sentiments. What in Durkheim is a level of affective sympathy and solidarity, Kondylis names order from his socio-ontological standpoint, which is devoid of content and has no hierarchy of factors. But when Kondylis legislates for the ultimate principles of social ontology, claiming that, I quote, the ultimate reality is constituted by existences, individuals or groups which struggle for their self-maintenance and by necessity together for extending their power, unquote, this is from Power and Decision, he neglects the Durkheimian move with regards to the collective, which is marked in its inception by these affective values. Now, these are transferred by Kondylis from the ultimate realm to an epiphenomenon that emanates from decisions, historical decisions, along friend-enemy groupings. Kondylis is so convinced about the validity of this notion of a value-free theory on ultimate reality, conceding, as he says, that it stands or falls along rival theories that posit some other ultimate reality. Now, Durkheim's is one whose model primes friendship in the socio-ontological spectrum, but Kondylis seems to neglect, as I mentioned, findings from the world value surveys in sociology, which actually reflect what people themselves acknowledge as valuable, which demonstrates significant overlaps in the trends towards materialist or post-materialist values. The latter, of course, being constituted by a relaxation of adversarial binary schemes, such as the friend-enemy distinction. There also seem to be some legal, we can say, residues that surface in the socio-ontological spectrum and the friend-enemy distinction. The extreme enmity and extreme friendship seem to be conceptualized in terms of recognition. This is what Kondylis writes in The Political and Man. Moreover, in Power and Decision, the material elements prior to their being abstracted, hence observed, selected, hence particularized, hence relative, and thus impregnated with value individualism, are held by Kondylis to be, I quote, equivalent or of the same value. And you will pardon again my German because he uses the adjective gleichwertigen. Now, the seemingly logical requirement for equivalence is reiterated later in the text when Kondylis explains that what has no value, the opposite of value, lacks equally value and disvalue. So I repeat, what has no value, which is the opposite of value, lacks equally value and disvalue. Now, the entity of no value, one can surmise that reflects something like the Schellingian indivisible remainder, which Kondylis resorts to, social ontology in other words, to debunk normativity. But for example, today, someone like Slavoj Žižek, in finer dialectical fashion, energizes towards normative goals, exposing to some extent like Kondylis, normative closures as unethical in claiming to close the gap in the real. It's just that Žižek does it by tuning the gap to normativity. Underneath the perspectival pluralism of standpoints and the decisions that prime a perspective before the latter is ideologically cloaked as one that claims universality, there is, I argue, a latent Platonism in the modalities of the social. This is the Neo-Kantian influence I intimated earlier with Lasker and Rickert that reflects the transcendental validity of the extremes of the spectrum and its implicit incorporation in the anti-Platonist value pluralism of incommensurable value spheres that is so central to Max Weber's sociology. For example, it would be interesting to speculate on the very categories of power and decision, for they seem to be located to the realm of eternally valid categories, which in a faithful attachment to nihilism relate to real men, generically speaking, and to their life projects as, and here I would quote Foucault, the ever to be accomplished unveiling of the same. Like Foucault, to whose edifice Kondylis' ahistorical genealogies strikingly resemble, power and decision are divorced from politics, and like the Neo-Kantian positing of value as being eternally valid, they are divorced from politics and from law. They are prior to the universality of the law or of the justification of right. Moreover, social ontology figures as a moment of Kondylis' value-neutral nihilism. However, it also signals a danger in a moral practical retreatism or in a nihilist ataraxia, indifference, which has alarming electing of affinities to the bourgeois Philistine indifference, which, as Georg Simmel put it, it is the blasé attitude within advanced money economies. So despite Kondylis' proclamations for an ideologically free nihilism in line with Nietzschean nobility that he so spectacularly tries to excavate underneath philosophy and social theory, his own theory is also subject to stylized thought, Denkstil. For example, in Science, Power and Decision, Kondylis endorses a sociology of scientific knowledge that blends perspectivism with social conventionalism. He writes the following, quote, even in relation to observation in the strictest sense of the term, namely as a simple attentive glance, it can be discerned that to the degree that objects are perceived as forms, observation is infused with elements that can be reduced to the observer's individual or social thought styles, unquote. The phrase thought style comes from the Polish epidemiologist, who is not quoted in the text, and lay sociologist Ludwig Fleck, whose reflections on the genesis and developments of a scientific fact, Fleck's study was about syphilis in 1935, provided a conventionalist epistemology of natural sciences that paved the way not only to Thomas Kuhn, but also to the strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge at Edinburgh. If this is the case, then, Kondylis' nihilist worldview should also, for purposes of consistency, be seen as stylized thought. So, for example, Karl Popper's falsificationism is stylized enlightenment epistemology, and Kuhn's paradigms is an example of stylized romanticism. To the extent that Kondylis seeks to persuade readers, claiming a holistic overview and knowledge of all perspective anchored and perspective relative theories that claim totality, but end up in incompletely carved knowledge out of the natural or socio-ontological spectrum, Kondylis's claims to impartial truth must crumble as ideological too. Now, one last objection could be launched by the Marxian perspective. This would point to the fact that social ontology is unmediated by the socio-historical becoming. It reflects a violence of abstraction, which I think is one of Marx's phrases, to which Kondylis wishes to compress philosophy and social theory in its entirety, as well as the history of modern societies could be considered an ideology itself. Kondylis' categories turn up as reified crystallizations of social relations based on determinate shapes of inequality and violence that are now ontologized, frozen and divested of time as it were, placed in a suprahistorical tribunal of descriptive decisionist throne from which history's marches to progress are frowned upon and its defeats are silently celebrated by a tacit smile of irony. I would like to finish in the next, I don't think it's going to take me more than 5 to 7 minutes, on a brief and last reference to Kondylis' sociological diagnostics. So the second relevance comes by way of Kulturkritik. The 1995 Greek translation of his book on the decline of bourgeois societies contains a long and dense introduction written specifically for the Greek readers. Its title is Introduction to the Greek Edition, The Sickliness of the Bourgeois Element in Contemporary Greek Society and Ideology. In this polemical text, Kondylis explains the methodological presuppositions for the critique to be unfolded. I quote, "Understanding goes into depth only if the historical and sociological categories or types are supplemented with intuitions and representations capable of enlivening within their immediate existential and experiential references those individual and collective human states from the condensation of which in this or that level of abstraction our concepts came to be," unquote. Now, for me, there is a pure Lebensphilosophie tone here when Kondylis refers to intuitions and lived experience and proceeds to provide a chronicle of Greek society's capitulation to mass democracy, as he intimates in this introduction. The invocation of Lebensphilosophie is not accidental. When Kondylis writes about the stylized thought of theories of science and of perception even, as we saw previously, then this can in turn apply to his program. Descriptive decisionism seems to me a stylized variant of Lebensphilosophie. Now, as the prominent scholar of German philosophy and social theory Friedrich Beisser writes, I quote, "Lebensphilosophie did live on through existentialism, which was its reincarnation. The existentialists inherited fundamental ideas of the popular philosophen, that existence is contingent and precedes essence, that there is no natural law of right or wrong, or justice or injustice, that the good life involves individuality and free decision, that who we are as human beings is formed by our history and culture," unquote. Now, from what has already been shown, such typical features of life philosophy also constitute core features of Kondylis' socio-ontological Kulturkritik. I shall skip Kondylis' struggle to contain a derogatory view of contemporary Greece within the contours of what for him is a value-free sociological diagnostic. I shall only mention that ultimately for Kondylis, I quote, "Greece figures in a very low position in the international system of material and intellectual labor," unquote. This is on page 47 in the Greek introduction. Now, this latter aspect, Greece figuring in a low position in intellectual labor. My colleague Lagoumitzi and I, in our book Sociology in Greece, Its History and Development, published, I repeat, in Springer, Palgrave 2022, we have contested, turning essentially Kondylis against himself, placing Kondylis next to Poulantzas and Castoriadis. We advance the thesis that in terms of sociological intellectual labor, Greece holds a remarkably high position. This would include Nikos Mouzelis, compared to the core centers of the discipline: Germany, United States, France, United Kingdom, Italy. Now, to go back to Faraklas's critique in his book Meaning and Sovereignty, which has a 150-page critique of Kondylis, very nuanced and very elaborate. But Faraklas doesn't mention Lebensphilosophie in typifying in Kondylis' theoretical coordinates. However, Faraklas, in that book, practices unintentionally a sociology of knowledge, which Kondylis repels, refusing to apply it to his own perspective. Thus, for Faraklas, and this is found on page 622 from the Greek book, Kondylis' worldview is a product of the mass democracy which irritates him, the axiological neutrality it imputes to science, the suspension of ethics, and the endorsement of nihilism cloaked with moral invocations of sorts. Now, despite the validity of Faraklas' critique, Kondylis' diagnostics bear, now I think escaping Faraklas' objections, relevance in a contemporary mass democracy. Because this contemporary mass democracy makes now axiological neutrality, value neutrality, a thing of the past, lost amid inflated value wars in a mass culture of creative self-making. This contemporary mass democracy ruminates the social construction of science. It hyper-moralizes society based on prophylaxis, in other words, what Jean Baudrillard called a euphemistic society, in the shape of political correctness, in other words, a forced and morally warlike neutralization of enemies. This contemporary mass democracy plays up hyper-differentiation of identities in what is a frenzy of pluralism with relativistic invocations of some universal morality. Ridiculing itself, of course, when its ethical nihilism reappears when such grandiose moral invocations fall flat in the face of harsh decisions and of unintended consequences of human action, like the ones that Kondylis so sagaciously incorporated into his edifice. Now, we cannot obviously enter further the paradoxes that stem from Kondylis' supremely ambitious work, but I think it is the merit of his quest for a social ontology as sociology's condition of possibility that requires a sustained and nuanced response from Greek sociologists. This talk was a first attempt at such a critical response. Thank you very much for your patience and for accommodating this extra 13 minutes to my exposition.
Thank you very much. I want to open the floor for any questions. Please also put your questions in the chat if you don't want to speak. I'm going to go first. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on sort of what you mean by certain Neo-Kantian presuppositions I think looking at the Political in Man and especially its bibliography and also the notes that PK had on volumes 2 and 3, which of course he never finished. It seems to me that at the level of categories, for example, he chides Heidegger for including guilt in his analysis of being, and he is constantly discussing, existential magnitudes, essentially again reprimanding thinkers for considering these existential magnitudes like fear, guilt, whatever. And instead, he wants to do, again, these ontological categories, things like power, decision, friend, foe, and also things like kinship, being, sorry, ideology is from here, from there. And it seems to me that these are based on, if again, if you look at his bibliography, lots of anthropological evidence, they are based on empirical evidence, essentially. This notion of a anthropological magnitude, where if you look at any society, you can consider all these, ethno-historical and ethno-cultural variations, but we can suppose that every society has some notion of has a language. Every society that has ever existed has names. And then kinship and all these things that are anthropological categories, which he then converts into ontological magnitude. So I was wondering if you could, so to me it seems very empirical. So I was wondering if you could say something about, maybe he doesn't necessarily use them in an empirical way due to his abstract way of formulating these questions. So I was wondering if you could expound upon the notion of normativity that you described and these sort of Neo-Kantian presuppositions.
Yeah, thanks very much. No, that this is so fascinating about Kondylis, particularly the Political in Man, where he actually draws on a remarkable corpus of work in anthropology. So, in a sense, it's kind of very interesting that he's trying to master empirical empirical validations for what he claims. I mentioned in an apostrophe in my talk that he actually seems to prime at some stage a socio-ontologically oriented anthropology as maybe the closest partner to social ontology, even closer to social ontology than sociology. My argument for Neo-Kantianism is that from the moment that Weber is brought into Kondylis' system with such force, Weber himself encompasses the Neo-Kantian problematic. In other words, when Weber talks about the different value spheres and relevancies, so there is value relevance for Weber. It's impossible not to, it's impossible to bracket value relevancies because you won't have a perspective. But once you have value relevancies, right, you must, in a sense, adhere scientifically to value neutrality. Well, these value relevancies are essentially an attempt on Weber's part to grapple with the Neo-Kantian problem of knowledge, which, with regards to the Methodenstreit in Germany, with that particular controversy, we started with Menger and Schmoller, and then it was actually repackaged into the whole, in a sense, discussion about values and the validity of values. The entire sociological corpus of classical sociological theory, including Simmel and Durkheim, Leopold von Wiese, is suffused with this problematic. Weber himself refers to Lask as a brilliant philosopher, suggesting that there are three possible approaches to knowledge. One is Lask's, the hiatus irrationalis. The other one is Hegel's, and the entire Hegelian tradition, if one includes, of course, Marx and so on and so forth, where that unknowable totality is also part of totality's own, in a sense, movement. And the third epistemology is Weber's, the epistemology of ideal types. So this is why I quoted the Kondylis' definition of decision. To me, and this is, I may be wrong, of course, but the fact that Kondylis doesn't refer, I don't know if this would have been parts of the political and man of the volumes that unfortunately have not been written, and exist only, I think, scattered notes, and so on and so forth, the extent to which Kondylis would actually grapple with that particular problem. But the whole idea that from an uncharted totality, I select a standpoint, I observe, I mark that unmarked space, as Luhmann says, right, with a distinction, and I create a system versus an environment, and I keep reproducing that from a system of relevancies. And this goes again for Luhmann, is a Neo-Kantian approach. And to me, the most succinct interpretation of that is the one by Emil Lusk with the Hiatus Irrationalis. I know Kondylis doesn't refer, and I haven't read everything by Kondylis, far from it. So I don't know if he's aware of it, but of him. But it seems to me as a pattern of a epistemological standpoint to be cut and paste from Neo-Kantianism. And of course, here he bumps on the issue of relevancies. Can we configure a social ontology without man? If we can, and if this cannot happen, then he violates his own principle of the equal value that is attributed to social relation, the political and man. If this cannot happen, in other words, if it's possible to have a social ontology without man, then to me, I may be wrong, this is Neo-Kantian Platonism. It's the eternal validity of values, which of course later in Max Scheler, and I know that, for instance, Kondylis would grapple with Max Scheler, but and from what I've been discussing with colleagues here in Greece, who seem to have had some access to the unpublished manuscripts from the other volumes. Possibly there is somewhere more extended there on Max Scheler. It would have been so interesting to have seen what how Kondylis would have dealt with Scheller's anthropology, which includes all these value modalities, because essentially it's the same problem. It's just that in Scheler is transformed into an a priori anthropology, to which I'm much more kind of sympathetic compared to Kondylis. But so I don't know if I can if this kind of answers your question, but it seems to me that that's why I insisted very much in measuring Kondylis against also what he endorses in terms of stylized perceptions or thoughts. It's the same style of epistemology, and I would even say the same argument. So I don't know. This is my answer, but this is why I think it's such a supremely ambitious project, which requires because many sociologists in Greece sort of like dismiss Kondylis as a decisionist. And of course, this is exactly what a value neutral scientist shouldn't do, right? By just creating a tag and trying to compress everything that Kondylis says. And what you mentioned about the empirical evidence from anthropology is precisely one of the many recalcitrant clusters in Kondylis's work, which would actually force sociologists who may be not particularly sympathetic to the political ramifications of Kondylis to take him very, very seriously. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you that he's trying also to, in a sense, found this along empirical evidence.
Yeah, thank you for your response. I did find that you mentioned, for example, his attack on Parsons, and if you again in the first chapter of Political and Man, he has a very I don't know if I'd call it selective interpretation, but very specific interpretation of all these what he calls mass democratic thinkers, and it seems to me that it's not so much that he purposefully compresses them, but rather it's done for the edifice of essentially trying to say that all of these thinkers in various forms neglect these anthropological considerations because he's always talking about, for example, systems theory or cybernetics or Luhmann or all these other figures. But again, all of it's in a very specific reading of trying to expose the lack of anthropology rather than a holistic overview of their thought.
Which again is unfair. It's a bit unfair for Parsons because in Parsons, within the entire system of action, the category L, the modality L, latent pattern maintenance, is about culture and it is about anthropology. So again, that's a bit unfair on Parsons, which, by the way, Parsons is being interpreted largely, it's his own fault because he develop systems theory as if he doesn't consider empirical evidence, which he certainly does. But what I find, what I mentioned with regards to Parsons is this, that maybe the modalities of inflation and deflation, which are central and unfortunately they seem to be generally downplayed in discussions in sociology, for me, they would seem to be able to accomplish what Kondylis says cannot be accomplished. In other words, to configure the socio-ontological spectrum from a situation of total altruism and friendship to the ultimate enmity in the shape of what? Of a genocide, of a kind of civil war, or a coup d'etat, or civil unrest, or whatever within within the polis, from a spectrum which is already part and parcel of the social, rather than the reverse. Because Kondylis he praises Parsons. He says that Parsons has to be credited because Parsons talks about power, and Parsons he sort of seems to knock on the door of social ontology, but essentially he's trying to sort of like confiscate it. Well, it seems to me that probably this confiscation is the right way, what Parsons is doing, because at least it protects him from this, in a sense, ontologization. Not necessarily that ontology is wrong, because probably there's no way we can get rid of it. But this sort of like constant reference to the unknowable, not yet formed social ontology. So, and it's odd to say this and defend Parsons, because precisely Parsons has been accused of coming up with abstractions and with extremely complex abstractions. Well, it seems to me that Parsons' abstractions carry more historical weight than what Kondylis reserves into the realm of ahistorical, which is social ontology.
Thank you. I want to read a question in the chat from Jack Blake. He asks, how does Kondylis see nihilism, and with regards to active nihilism versus passive nihilism?
Yeah, I think thanks for the question. I think this is the distinction that he makes between de Sade and Lagoumitzi. I think he chides de Sade for, in a sense, elevating nihilism into an ethical ought. And I think he uses, if you read, which I'm sure if you read the book on the Enlightenment, he cites this very important book by Lester Croker, Nature. What is Nature and Culture? I think it's a book that charts the history of French Enlightenment and has a very long chapter on French materialism. And the culmination of French materialism is de Sade, Lagoumitzi, and de Sade. And Kondylis seems to be saying that this doesn't happen with Lagoumitzi, that Lagoumitzi does not fall into it doesn't make the transgression to elevate nihilism into an ethical position. So this is why I intimated in the paper that when Kondylis, I think it happens at the end of Power and Decision, says, why am I doing all this? And he says, well, I'm doing it for vanity, or I'm doing it, in other words, simply to provoke. But essentially, I'm advocating a theory which, if taken seriously, would actually dissolve society. So in a sense, so it's an interesting combination of narcissism and sort of stoicism on his part. I think this is one key difference that I can locate that. But I think it's foul play on Kondylis' part, because from a point onwards, he seems to prescribe and he seems to legislate. So I think he cannot really contain the so-called ataraxia, the so-called nihilist distance, um, um, from making prescriptions. And now that I think about it, well, if he thinks that his own theory is so dangerous to society, well, that's actually an altruistic ethical standpoint, because he actually seems to protect society from, taking his theory more kind of seriously than it kind of should. Um, but I think this is all I can offer with regards to. I think the key lies in the Lagoumitzi de Sade distinction and his preference for Lagoumitzi. Thank you.
Your comments also did remind me of this, because you were talking a little earlier about culture critique.
Mm.
In I think in the end of Decline, there's this one section where he says that he's not really sure if mass democracy is necessarily a bad thing. But then he kind of oscillates over that. And it seems to me that he has a maybe even like personally contradictory view on these things, where he'll attack Greece. I remember he's very harsh at various times. I think he says something like Greece is the toilet of Europe or something like that. Very, very
Yeah.
harsh. And so he's very, very obviously polemical, and in his more less formal academic work, in his like newspaper articles, he's very purposefully polemical, but then he kind of oscillates on that. And so it seems to me there's a kind of tension in him, sort of as a scientist, whether even if one doesn't believe in his descriptive decisionism, but he does. And so there's a tension in his own view of normativity, that he personally advocates for, and non-normativity that he sees as a
Mhm.
scientist.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, especially that introduction, the Greek introduction to the introduction of the Greek edition, which is written for Greece. I mean, God, I mean, he's very perceptive, and he manages certainly to identify various pathologies with regards to clientelism, and with regards also to psychological syndromes between Greeks. That Greeks are, for instance, caught into this kind of uh, consumerism and clientele networks, and that they are kind of sort of like petty, but at the same time, they have this kind of prickly nationalism and so on. And whenever Greece is actually being sort of, there's something negative stated about Greece, they just kind of feel offended and so on and so forth. So he's very perceptive, but um, these are far from value neutral kind of remarks. I mean, he certainly describes a situation which um, should not have been the case. I mean, he would have hoped that Greece would do other things. That's why I simply mentioned the placement of Greece for Kondylis in a low intellectual hierarchy. Um, so why would you say that? I mean, because it's clearly a negative value judgment. I mean, you're clearly making a not judgment here, a deontological judgment. Kondylis would say that it's a factual judgment, but then one have to inquire about, the justification mastered, and the justification mastered, as if you read about it, there's a very, very uncomplimentary epithets with regards to Greece. I mean, he uses the term sub-mediocrities, right? Well, who can be called a mediocrity and take it as a kind of neutral statement, value-free statement? I mean, it's a value-laden epithet. So, and I think this is what I've tried, in a sense, in an apostrophe, to say that we've tried, in a sense, to rescue Kondylis, because we honestly believe, when we wrote that book in 2022, that Kondylis deserves urgently. First of all, he deserves an entry into the Anglo-Saxon audience, and there's very, very little of that. And I think my colleague Raymond Petridis has translated some of his work at Telos, I think. But he deserves greater visibility in the Anglo-Saxon world. And as far as the community of sociologists in Greece is concerned, he hasn't been brought into part of the discussion, only very sporadically. And I honestly think, regardless of my criticism of the political and man, I mean, I'm kind of actually humbled by the book, that I would probably consider it, as a sociologist, as one of the 2 or 3 most rigorous sociological theory books that have been written, by a Greek intellectual. And Kondylis is not a sociologist, but I would regard The Political and Man as essentially a sociological theory book. In that sense, I think that there is, as you rightly say, a sort of like tension, which I think it's unfair on Kondylis, because sometimes it seems to me that he succumbs to ressentiment criticism. In a certain sense, that there's a lot of a Greek scholar. I don't know if many of you would. I noticed there are some Greek colleagues maybe here. Cosmas Psychopedis, who was also educated in Germany at Göttingen, and very much into German idealism. Seems to make an analogy with Heinz Kohut's syndromes of narcissistic rage, which is kind of interesting to look at it in terms of both what Kondylis wants to do against normative theories, which he would accuse him of what Kohut understands as anti-gravity, that normative theories want somehow to escape the gravity of the socio-ontological kind of realm. And I think that would be a very, very interesting conception. So in a sense, he seems to hold normative theories in check as sort of like narcissistic, but at the same time, this can be turned against Kondylis, that his own debunking systematic rage, right? But it's of course a very sophisticated rage, but it's still a rage against normative theories, is also part of that narcissistic syndrome that Heinz Kohut describes so interestingly in his analysis on the narcissistic self. So I think it cuts both ways.
Thank you very much. Sorry, we have another question in the chat I wanted to read. Does Kondylis ever talk about Johann Georg Haman's work? I apologize if this is already answered.
Thank you for the question. I cannot answer. I mean, I think I mean, some of yesterday's speaker, I think they're infinitely more well versed than me in German philosophy. So I'm sorry to say with like that with great embarrassment that I have no idea. If he refers to him in the book on the Enlightenment, it's one of those things that I've actually bypassed. So I apologize for being unable to answer.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello. First of all, thank you, Dr. Gangas, for an incredible talk. I have a question that
Thank you.
comes more from maybe like a cognitive science perspective. So Kondylis' critique of normativity, and particularly the definition of decision he gives in Parent Decision, it appears to challenge kind of accounts of meaning that we find in theories of language, like in philosophy of language. These frameworks often lack historicism and uh, um, uh, and so the historical perspective. On the other hand, we have like cyberneticists and systems theorists who tend to treat culture and social communication building from Shannon's mathematical theory of communication, where he explicitly omits the question of meaning altogether and kind of treats it distributionally. But there is some agreement that understanding of meaning is, in some sense, being able to use information encoded within the context. And so semantics um, based on distributional understanding is limited. So understanding is functional and goes outside of domain of mere language and is in some sense social knowledge, like individual circumstances of an agent of a person. So I wanted to ask, like, from your perspective, could you talk about how Kondylis treats this question of meaning and share some of your personal thoughts on how would you um, define meaning and understanding, and if it does come from a decision ultimately, and that pure propositions might not have a meaning, and they only have a meaning by our relation to them.
Wow. Yeah, thanks very much. Again, I'm not at all sort of like I don't feel equipped enough to go into cognitive psychology and linguistics in the problem of meaning. Maybe one model I can use is the one that has been drawn upon by the strong program in the sociology of science, which goes into that process of meaning by recourse to a sort of like triptych. And the triptych is, so we're talking about how sociologists are trying. So this is the Edinburgh School with Barry Barnes, David Bloor, Stephen Shapin from Canada, who I've kind of mentioned. Initially, the French kind of wing of Bruno Latour, although Latour parted with him. But the triptych is comprises of what? Of clearly our perception with regards to the objective natural world. Secondly, language games. So they draw upon Wittgenstein. So the idea of language games, which again, language games are very much in line with certain contexts and forms of life. And I don't know if Kondylis has ever drawn on Wittgenstein at all, because it would seem to me that he would find in late Wittgenstein, an ally with regards to language games. So if there is one component of knowledge and with regards to meaning, say for the strong program, would be perception and the understanding, perception of the objective world. Two, language games. But three is a Durkheimian move, and it's the authority of the collective. The authority of the collective. So what I think the problem, so to give an example, if I have time, and this is an example that comes from Thomas Kuhn. I think Thomas Kuhn talks about it in The Essential Tension. And it's this kind of little boy, and the little boy walks with his dad in this kind of park. And the park has a lake, and the lake has swans, ducks, and geese. And of course, the boy points to a duck and says, "This is a goose," and the father says, "No, this is a duck." So what the argument here is that, of course, there is perception that is important. Secondly, it is language, that we use the word duck for this particular bird, which is similar to the bird goose, but not identical. Now, the key difference here, which is introduced by the strong program in the stabilization of meaning, is the authority of the father or the parent. In that example, I think is a father, but it was obviously a parent or a significant other, who actually says to the child, no, this is a goose. So for Barnes and Bloor and that kind of strong program, what the father's corrective move represents is the authority of the collective. Now, I'm pretty sure that have bumped on something like this on Political and Man, but it's the kind of Durkheimian idea that ultimately knowledge is validated and obviously, by the collective, values, conventions, and the collective ideals. Kondylis is aware of that problem because he actually deals with Durkheim and so on and so forth. I'm not sure he deals with the Durkheim's book on religion, because this is actually the book when actually Durkheim seeks to correct the entire theory of knowledge in philosophy and make it a social theory of knowledge by actually suggesting that the ultimate transcendental conditions of knowledge are not simply the a priori categories in Kant, but the socially matricized categories of space, time, and causality that reflect the affective values of society. The difference here would be that what is the remainder of that particular process of generating meaning on the basis of perception and the cognitive capacities of the human mind, language games, but also the authority of society, the authority of the collective. It seems to me that all these are, but again, I have to be very careful here. There seem to be that ultimately are compressed into the code decision. So they become decision becomes this rather undifferentiated entity. It is a decision if I call it goose, swan, or duck, but it's a decision that is binding for society and binds all members of society. If members of society want to be, as Shaping suggests, taken seriously as credible kind of generators and recipients of meaning. I feel that Kondylis condenses this into decision, but I have to give this answer with great reservation because I need to revisit, for instance, the passages when he talks about George Herbert Mead, the American social psychologist, behaviorist, and sociologist, who talks about the I and the me, and talks about, for instance, how meaning is formed through this process of social interaction and sort of like essentially refers to a natural world, but essentially emerges through this process of social interaction. But yeah, I would say that this is my answer. This is what I find as an interesting model of the generation of meaning and knowledge in society.
Thank you very much for your answer. You bring up a lot of very, very interesting things, and I was also thinking about Wittgenstein's language games, and there is some things that Kandylis says about Wittgenstein about like lacking historicism and kind of this connection to perhaps like anthropology in broadest sense. And so I was wondering if uh um the if even there is a sense that any propositional statements on their own would have meaning as when they're not being kind of perceived by a decision-making agent by or outside of it's hard to even imagine this. I suppose it's not even this is the I guess it arose from the question of we have um, we have had for a while this famous thought experiment with Searle's Chinese room, where there is a person inside the room having a dictionary. He doesn't know Chinese, and he has kind of messages passed under the door, and he responds based on a dictionary. And now we have all of these advanced language models that kind of emulate communication. But these language models, they only distributionally correlate text to text, but they pass as a human interlocutor to some extent, at least. Um, and so I think the question arose that they functionally um, in in this kind of um, uh, outside view, black box view, emulate semantics, but they don't have there is no in some sense pretty much everyone has an intuition that there is no meaning to the output of these models because they're not participants in society and they don't have desires, intents, they don't have a world model. And so the relationship between kind of the outside world model and forming concepts and also the social reality of culture and uh and the kind of odds the goals that are being pursued um it in some sense feels deeply connected to this question. And um, I suppose if you have any like additional thoughts based on that, I really like your answers. I just wanted to add to some additional context.
Well,
If
thanks very much. I'm totally, I think, kind of unfamiliar with any details from the experiments you've mentioned. I don't know. Again, I have to improvise. I mean, maybe one source, because I think I can't. I'm not sure if I think Professor Edinger mentioned it yesterday with kind of reference to Luhmann, and I think in sociological systems theory, which is I think an important source of inspiration for Kondylis, you have the problem of double contingency, and I think this is also what may lie beneath this surplus of uncharted territory that makes meaning possible. And I have associated with the hiatus irrationalis by Lask. In other words, that there's always a gap in how the emission of a message, a vocal gesture, for example, which in its complicated, in its complex form is language, will be taken on board by the interlocutor, the addressee, and what the addressee will decide to consider as essential or inessential from that utterance. So that's the first contingency. So the second contingency is once the addressee makes a selection from that particular utterance, the generator of meaning has now to assume that the response is one that you know that the response given is premised on the idea that the first utterance was actually fully understood, and that's kind of the double contingency because it's again it kind of primes it is a sort of like selection, and it is a kind of problem that is, in a sense, set up by Parsons initially. And in Parsons, it seems to have a resolution, but Luhmann plays it up because he wants, in other words, to, like Kondylis, I think, to differentiate systems of meaning based on functional imperatives. So if system A, which is the economic system, looks at system B, and system B is the system of art and aesthetic expression, so we have different value relevancies, and both systems are looking at the world, but they're looking at the world with different meaning conferring interests, then the problem of double contingency is that the system of the economy will look at the system of art, but would look at it only within the relevancies of its own code. What, for instance, in the domain of aesthetic production could qualify as profitable? And I think it seems to me that this is one of the reasons why Kondylis insists so much on the impossibility of a universal configuration of meaning, because he seems to be saying that that universality is simply is an ersatz universality. Simply, it is a universality interpreted by each subsystem, by each meaning generating for adaptive purposes initially, and power aggrandizement secondarily, groups, individuals, okay, or even value systems. I know I haven't answered your question, but because I'm not at all familiar with that territory, something that I would need to certainly go back and revisit and learn a lot to be able to come up with an answer. But thanks for the stimulus. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting, very and very informative.
Thank you.